The flight attendant almost didn't notice him at first, just another tired passenger in a middle seat, a toddler balanced on one knee, and a crumpled boarding pass in his free hand, eyes already red before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. He wasn't crying, not exactly. He was doing that thing people do when they've forgotten how to cry, holding everything so tight inside that the grief had nowhere left to go. So it just sat there in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he kept pressing his lips to the top of his little girl's head, like he was trying to memorize the smell of her hair. Most people looked away. Most people always do. But if you had been sitting across the aisle from Marcus that afternoon on Flight 1174 out of Dallas-Fort Worth, you might have felt something shift in your chest, some quiet, uncomfortable recognition that this man was carrying a weight you couldn't see and couldn't name. And you might have asked yourself honestly what you would have done, whether you would have looked away too. Marcus Trevino was 34 years old, and he had been a single father for exactly 11 months and 16 days. He didn't count the days on purpose. They just kept arriving, one after another, each one a little heavier than the last. His wife, Serena, had died in February. A car accident on a wet Texas highway. The kind of thing that makes no sense no matter how many times someone tries to explain it to you. She had been driving back from her night shift at the hospital, a nurse who had spent 12 hours caring for strangers, and she never made it home. Their daughter, Ava, had just turned 2. She didn't understand where her mother had gone. Some nights she still called out for her in the dark, and Marcus would lie there in the silence afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a person was supposed to explain eternity to someone who still called orange juice yellow drink. He had taken the job in Colorado not because he wanted to leave Texas, but because staying had become impossible. Every street corner held a version of Serena, the grocery store where she used to squeeze every avocado, the park bench where they had sat on their first date, pretending to feed ducks while really just looking at each other. His mother had told him that running away from grief never worked, and he knew she was right. But there is a difference between running away and simply being unable to breathe. Marcus had reached the point where he needed air, and Colorado felt like the only window left open. So there he was in seat 16A with Ava asleep against his chest somewhere over New Mexico, her small fist curled around the collar of his flannel shirt, her breath slow and even against his neck. He had one earbud in, playing the soft acoustic playlist Serena had made for long road trips, and he was looking out the window at nothing. At the particular kind of nothing that is actually everything. The whole gray-blue sweep of a late afternoon sky stretching out in every direction. He wasn't thinking about the job. He wasn't thinking about the apartment he hadn't yet seen, the city where he didn't know a single person, the life he was about to begin assembling from scratch. He was thinking about a Tuesday morning 3 years ago when Serena had burned the pancakes and laughed so hard she had to sit down on the kitchen floor, and how that laugh had been the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, and how he would give every remaining Tuesday of his life just to hear it one more time. He didn't notice the shift in the cabin until the woman in 16B leaned slightly toward the window and whispered something to her husband. Marcus followed their gaze and saw it. 2 fighter jets, one on each side of the commercial aircraft, close enough that the military insignia on the wings was clearly visible. His first thought was alarm, the kind that seizes the stomach before the mind has time to catch up. His second thought, almost immediately after, was recognition. He knew those jets. He knew the silhouette. He knew exactly what they were and exactly what their presence alongside a civilian aircraft could mean, and for one terrible second, his whole body went cold. Then the pilot's voice came over the intercom. The announcement was calm, deliberate, and unlike anything most of the passengers aboard that flight had ever heard in their lives. The captain explained that the aircraft had been briefly intercepted, not as a threat but as an escort. He explained that according to the passenger manifest and communication with ground control, there was someone aboard who had earned something that most people never receive and fewer still understand. And then he said a name and a call sign and a designation that Marcus hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 2 years. The call sign was Ironwood. The designation was United States Air Force, retired first lieutenant. The name was his. Marcus sat completely still. Ava stirred against his chest, but didn't wake. Around him, he could hear the quiet murmur of passengers beginning to understand what was happening, phones lowering, conversations stopping, heads turning. The captain continued, his voice steady and warm, explaining in brief terms what Marcus had done during his service, the mission that had earned him a commendation he had never discussed with anyone except Serena, the kind of act that doesn't get made into movies because it is too quiet and too costly and too real. He had gone back. That was the simplest way to say it. When everyone else had gotten out, Marcus Trevino had gone back for two men who could not go back for themselves, and he had carried them out under fire. And he had never once called it heroic, because to him it had simply been the only possible choice. Through the small oval window, both F-35 pilots executed a slow, deliberate salute, not a casual gesture. A full, formal, sustained salute, held long enough that no one in the cabin could mistake it for anything other than what it was. An acknowledgement, a debt, a recognition offered from one warrior to another across the thin, cold air at 35,000 feet. Marcus pressed his face into the top of Ava's head and closed his eyes. His shoulders shook just once, and then he got very still again. He was not thinking about the mission the captain had described. He was not thinking about the commendation, or the salute, or the rows of strangers around him who had begun to applaud, softly at first, then with the kind of fullness that rises when people feel something they can't explain, but know is important. He was thinking about Serena. He was thinking that she would have squeezed his arm and cried and then tried to pretend she wasn't crying, and that she would have told Ava someday when Ava was old enough to understand, that her father was the bravest man she had ever known, not because of the mission, because of every ordinary Tuesday since. The woman in 16B reached over and touched his arm, not intrusively, just a brief, wordless contact, the kind that means "I see you." The man across the aisle nodded at him with the expression of someone who has just been reminded of something they had almost forgotten about the world. A flight attendant who had been standing frozen at the front of the cabin pressed her hand briefly over her heart, and Marcus, who had not slept more than 4 hours in a single night since February, who had driven a U-Haul through 3 states with a toddler and a box of photographs and the particular exhaustion of a man who has lost his reason and is slowly, painfully building a new one. Marcus finally exhaled. A long, broken, necessary exhale, like a door long shut being opened at last. Ava woke up just as the jets banked away into the sky. She looked up at her father with wide, clear eyes, and he looked down at her, and whatever passed between them in that moment was not something language was designed to hold. He kissed her forehead and pointed out the window and said something to her quietly, and she pressed her small hand flat against the glass as if she could touch the empty sky where the jets had been. He arrived in Colorado with 1 bag, 1 child, and no idea how the next chapter was supposed to begin. But he got off the plane. He walked through the terminal. He found his car at the rental counter and buckled Ava into her seat and drove out into the cold, bright mountain air. And for the first time in 11 months and 16 days, the weight on his shoulders felt like something he might someday be able to set down. Not today, but someday. And sometimes that is enough. If Marcus's quiet courage reminded you of someone you know, a parent, a veteran, a stranger who carried more than anyone realized, drop their name in the comments below. They deserve to be seen. If this story reached something real inside you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not for the numbers, but because stories like this one deserve to find the people who need them most.